Now that the dust has settled on the 2023-2024 NHL season, it's time to see where the Florida Panthers stack up in recent NHL history.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. My name is Nick Zararis, the host of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodies, one of the co-hosts of Locked On Penguins. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sport stops sportsing like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster of bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, today's episode is very straightforward, friends. We're going to talk about the last 10 teams to win the Stanley Cup. We're going to attempt to rank them fairly and objectively, and we're going to have some fun along the way. So, the one thing I do want to lay out before we start talking is, obviously, Hunter and I are two different people. So what we prioritize and what we value in ranking these teams might be slightly different. So just to give you an idea of my criteria, how I've graded these teams, the teams they beat along the way in the postseason is the thing I care about the most. That has the most weight in my rubric, my things. Individual talent. So like if a team has like 4 future Hall of Famers, I'm going to rank that team ahead of some other teams. How they performed in the regular season, whether they got hot in the postseason or they were dominant all year round. And then some more of the kind of feel stuff of how improbable was the run, how likely was the run, that type of thing. So without further ado, Hunter, I'm going to throw it over to you first and we can get started. You and I, we both have the same bottom 2 teams. So this first part will be easy.
Right. And just to go off what you said as well, Nick, I look at regular season success, individual talent, the teams they beat along the way, but most importantly for me, how they played in the Stanley Cup playoffs. How dominant was this team? And my bottom team, please, Blues fans, do not yell at me. I have the 2019 Blues as the number 10 team out of the last 10 Stanley Cup winners. They just really didn't have that good of a regular season. Yes, they did catch fire a little bit with Craig Berube taking over and, play Gloria during the Stanley Cup playoffs was awesome. It was such an improbable run. But Nick, you look up and down that roster, they weren't that good of a team compared to some of the other winners over the years. It had some really close calls, I feel like, in the playoffs. Overall, Jordan Binnington was obviously outstanding. But when I look at that Blues team compared to the 9 other teams that we're going to discuss, I feel like they're the weakest overall. Yes, they did beat a pretty good Boston Bruins team in the Stanley Cup final. But still, a couple of times during that playoff run, they were very close to getting eliminated. So they definitely had a little bit of luck go their way. I mean, I feel like every championship team needs a little bit of luck to go their way. But just when I stack everything up against the other teams, I have the Blues number 10 on my list.
I agree. I have the Blues 10th as well. The first thing you want to talk about, you said the playoff path. It took to a Game 7 against Boston. They got some of the most favorable officiating I can recall. For officiating in a Stanley Cup final to stick in my brain 5 years later, I still talk to Bruin fans who bring up Noah Acciari just blatantly getting tripped and the referees let it go because there was 14 seconds left in the game and it was effectively a prison rule situation. Individual talent, I think there's a real argument the Blues are the only team on this list that only has a single or maybe no future Hall of Famers. Alex Pietrangelo, the only player who comes to mind. Ryan O'Reilly is a fringe case, depending on what happens down the road, maybe. But when you talk about it in terms of the individual talent, every other team on this list has at least 2, if not 3 or 4. And that's a differentiation point. As you said, the regular season results, they do matter when we're comparing all of these teams. And famously, the Blues were in dead last in January, so very clearly got hot at the right time and kind of put it together as it went along. Improbable nature of the playoff run, but they arguably have the best story of anyone on this list. And that is one thing that I do want to point out, that to go from dead last to winning the Stanley Cup to beating teams that are just outright more talented and better than you, that is impressive. That does matter. Someone has to be low man on the totem pole. And based on the criteria that we both value, the Blues have to be 10th, just based on the results, the players on the team, and how they got to where they had to go. So I'll throw it back to you for number 9, which we both have the same number 9 as well.
Yes, I have the Washington Capitals at number 9. No disrespect to Alex Ovechkin and company. They got their Stanley Cup during that core window. But when you look at that Capitals team compared to the Capitals team in 2016 and 2017, that 2018 Caps team was not nearly as good. They just got hot at the right time, and it took that level of Caps team to go all the way. I mean, Nick, they had Devontae Smith-Pelly playing in their top 6 the Stanley Cup playoffs. They had that big comeback, obviously, against Columbus. They had the big playoff series win against the Penguins as well. Once they won that, I honestly kind of felt like they were going to go all the way because they got that monkey off their back. Yeah, they were struggling at least a little bit against Tampa Bay, at least during parts of that series. But the way they were able to dominate in Game 7, I'm like, yeah, I don't think they're going to be losing this Stanley Cup final against Vegas. But when I still stack them up to the other teams, I still feel like they're a bit weaker overall just with the regular season they had. Some of the players that were getting big minutes in their lineup, their stars just went off. And sometimes that's all you need.
I completely agreed with you in that respect as far as Washington. Like you had mentioned, they won the 2 President's Trophies the years before they won the Stanley Cup. And they had a bit of a roster attrition because they couldn't afford to keep everybody because those teams were so good. Big trades at the deadline that didn't pan out for guys like Shattenkirk. You had the emergence of Kuznetsov during that playoff run. That really made a big difference for them. But to your point, Dmitry Orlov playing big minutes, Matt Niskanen at 31 playing big minutes. Not exactly the most star-studded. Brooks Orpik playing a big role in their playoff run. Just not a very talented group, but they do have 2 future Hall of Famers, more likely than not, in Backstrom and Ovechkin. That puts them ahead of St. Louis. The path a little bit more difficult going through the teams they did. The regular season results better than St. Louis's, and ultimately winning in emphatic fashion. Pulling away in the Cup final, even if it is against the misfit Vegas team. They won the Cup final in 5 games. They took care of business. They didn't drag it out. That does matter as far as the criteria and evaluation. So very clearly, at least at the beginning, this exercise has proved reasonably doable. It's about to get a whole lot harder because we're talking about some of the best teams of the last 20 to 30 years. But so far, this is a reasonable exercise.
Right, no, I agree. This is where I think these next 8 teams, I'm sure, are going to make some people mad in the comments or just mad in general here. Number 8, I know this is going to rile people up, Nick. I have the 2020-2021 Tampa Bay Lightning.
Okay.
I know. Put your pitchforks away, everyone. I know how good that Lightning team was, but 56 game season, they finished 3rd in the Central Division. At the time, they went 36-17-3. They had great production from their top players, but I look at their path overall, Nick. They dominated the Florida Panthers. They dominated the Hurricanes, that Hurricanes team that I feel like really wasn't fully ready for that moment. Yeah, they did have a tough series against
they squeaked it out with the Islanders, yeah.
Yeah, that was at least a really good series. But then we all knew who was going to win that Stanley Cup final. I know Montreal had a very fun Cinderella run to the Stanley Cup final, but they really had no shot of beating the Lightning in that final with how Tampa Bay was humming. I know that Lightning team was very good, but just their path in general, I feel like overall wasn't that difficult compared to some of these other teams. And it really wasn't a surprise to see Tampa Bay win it again, considering how they returned most of the production from the season prior. So overall, I look at this Tampa Bay team, I have them number 8. I have the other Tampa Bay team the year before much higher on this list.
I think the argument for putting that iteration of Tampa Bay here is the 56 game season, yes, the regular season results, because at this point now we're going to be splitting hairs the rest of the way. Real quick, I have the 2014-15 Blackhawks here, mostly because that roster was just kind of depleted at that point, that they had lost guys from the previous 2 cup runs. But I see the argument for Tampa Bay. We are going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and we're going to keep moving along our list. So be sure to stay tuned to this edition of Locked On NHL. Locked On NHL, your team every day. I love sports. I love them so much, I never want them to stop. But now that the playoffs are over and we're in the dead of summer, there are fewer games. All we have is women's basketball. We have baseball. We do have the Olympics starting, but there's not a whole lot to pick from. But FanDuel lets us keep the sports going whenever we want. All we have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime we're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. So if you were so inclined and you wanted to click over to FanDuel, you could get the Oilers at 8.5 to 1 to win the Stanley Cup. If you think the Panthers are going to go back to back, 9.5 to 1. The Dallas Stars, my presumptive favorite for next year, at 10 to 1. The Devils and Avalanche at 11 to 1. The Hurricanes and Rangers at 14 to 1. You want a long shot? The Vancouver Canucks, 26 to 1 to win the Stanley Cup next year. So head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner, Major League Baseball. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I'll finish my point real quick on that Blackhawks team. Relatively depleted as far in comparison to the previous two iterations. If we were going further back, you would absolutely ding the Blackhawks team that won the Stanley Cup in the 40-game season in 12-13. But when you look at the 14-15 team, kind of the end of the window, I've mentioned it, Brad Richards playing second-line center, Duncan Keith playing 32 minutes a game because they only had 5 defensemen they felt comfortable playing. But still, obviously, a very talented hockey team.
But Keith was awesome that whole run.
Yes,
He had 21 points overall for the Blackhawks during that run. I have that Blackhawks team next on my list, Nick. So we're kind of similar overall. Yeah. I have that Blackhawks team number 7 overall on my list. Obviously, great team during the regular season. Kane was tremendous during the playoffs. So was Jonathan Toews. 21 points in 23 games for him overall. But when I look at their path overall, Nick, they dominated a Predators team in the first round. Minnesota, no chance to win that series in the second round. Chicago was dominating Minnesota during that era very much. They squeaked past a very talented Ducks team. And the Tampa Bay Lightning, that series was fun, but I just knew Chicago was going to win it due to how their high-end talent was playing compared to how Tampa Bay's was playing. Crawford was also tremendous in net. Some people forget that. Corey Crawford, when he was in his prime and on top of his game, I think was one of the more underrated goaltenders in the league, and you saw that on display throughout the playoffs. And again, that Blackhawks team, just a ton of fun to watch in the playoffs. They were dominant in most of their series, but I still have them number 7 on my list.
Yeah, and I'll go, I have the 21 Tampa team in this spot in 7. So the schedule, 56 truncated season, that's a ding. The quality of competition along the way, as you mentioned, that Florida team, that was their first foray into the postseason. And I believe 5 years since they lost to the Islanders in the first round, like 2015-16, I think was that year. First foray into the postseason against a good Tampa Bay team. Obviously, Tampa Bay coming off of a Stanley Cup, playing a President's Trophy team that hadn't really been in the wars yet. Carolina, you mentioned, wasn't really ready for prime time yet. And then their conference final matchup, it's reasonable, that Tampa Bay team against the against the Rangers, but that Tampa Bay team gets the easiest Cupcake Cup final matchup of all time in Montreal. I still don't understand how that was the format that was agreed to, because one side of the bracket was so much more difficult. And as you mentioned, the only difficult series the Lightning had on that run was the Islanders series. And that Islanders series is a Brock Nelson post away from going to overtime in Game 7. And you just think about how different the narratives are about that Islanders team if the Islanders break through and make the Stanley Cup final. Maybe Barry Trotz is still there. Maybe Barry Trotz wins the power struggle with Lou Lamoriello and Lou leaves as opposed to Trotz. So I will throw it back over to you for number 6.
Yeah, so for number 6 on my list, I have one of the 2 Penguins back-to-back teams. I have the 2017 Penguins at number 6. Obviously still a very good team that won the Cup, but they got by with how great their finishing was and how great both Marc-Andre Fleury and Matt Murray were. They lost the underlying numbers battle basically in every game, it felt like, during the playoffs. The process wasn't fully there, but they got the finishing, they got the goaltending. That's why the Penguins won the Stanley Cup that year. They blew past the Blue Jackets in 5 games, a team that they've mostly dominated throughout their time in the league. They get past that Washington team. They were up 3-1, Nick, on that Capitals team. That series almost ended in 5 games. The Penguins were up by 1 goal entering the third period in Game 5 in 2017. If the Penguins win that game, I think Trotz gets fired that next day. I don't even think he's there in 2018 overall to see the Capitals win the Stanley Cup. Heck, who knows if the Capitals even win the Stanley Cup that next year. That's just how big that third period was for Washington in general. But when you look at that series, the Penguins, their backs were against the wall heading into Game 7, but they still find a way just because they've had the upper hand on Washington for a good chunk of Crosby and Ovechkin's careers. And then you have that crazy series against Ottawa. You have a really fun cup final against Nashville. They had a pretty hard road overall just because the playoff format, I think, screwed them. I mean, they played 2 of the top 5 to 6 teams in the league in the first 2 rounds, for God's sake. But when I look at the 5 other teams in front of them, I still think the process was more there compared to that Penguins team. Again, don't get me wrong, that Penguins team was awesome. Crosby was on top of his game. Evgeny Malkin was great. They won that cup without Chris Letang, for God's sakes. Fleury and Murray were incredible, but I still think the 5 other teams in front of them were just a hair better, in my opinion.
I would agree with you. I have that Pittsburgh team in this slot as well. The differentiation point for our list is probably going to be up towards the top, but that Pittsburgh team, as you mentioned, the not carousel, but the volleying back and forth between Fleury and Murray at various points of that playoff run. Noah Tang, really good performances from the Stars. That depth really set that Penguins team apart, and that's really the sticking point of those 2 iterations of the Penguins, those 2 iterations of Tampa Bay, is that they had the quality third lines. You know, you can, if your team is good enough that you can play Phil Kessel on your third line most nights, you have a really talented forward group. There's no other way around it. When you can afford to play him with Bonino and Hagelin as your third line, on a lot of teams, that's a second line. And that quality of depth is really hard to come by. You know, you get the stamping of this group is not just they won the 1 cup. It's they went back to back. The path wasn't crazy. The first 2 rounds were difficult. I don't think anybody thought Ottawa was beating them, though somehow Ottawa had them kind of really uncomfortable. That Ottawa team, in hindsight, has aged very well. Like, if you go back and look at that roster in today's context, it looks very different, but at the time that seemed very improbable that 40-something-year-old Craig Anderson was going to get a team to the Stanley Cup final. Nonetheless, we got time to squeeze in one more before the next break. I throw it back to you, Hunter.
Give me the other Tampa Bay team at number 5. I know they might ruffle some feathers as well, but I have them just a hair below Colorado, Vegas, Florida, and the other Penguins team overall. That Tampa Bay team, people, I know, they were great. Nikita Kucherov, 85 points in 68 games during the regular season. He had 34 points in 25 games in the playoffs. Braden Point was incredible. Victor Hedman was about a point per game. Palat was awesome. But, you know, I look at just their path. I mean, the Blue Jackets, Tampa Bay was always going to win that series. Boston, I always felt like Tampa Bay was better than overall. The Islanders, at least a decently okay series. And then Dallas, I'm actually surprised that Tampa Bay won that series in 6 games just because I was really high on that Dallas team. I thought that series was going to go 7 games. So I know Tampa Bay was very dominant throughout that run, but I still think with the way Colorado played in their cup run, the way Vegas played, I just have them, again, a smidge above. We really are just splitting hairs right now, but I have that Tampa Bay team number 5. I can easily see an argument for them being top 3, though.
I have the 2021-22 Avalanche here. I think that Avalanche team was very good. Their path wasn't that difficult. They had the benefit of playing Tampa Bay coming off of 2 straight Stanley Cup Finals appearances. They had the Jackets in the first round. Excuse me, not the Jackets. They had Nashville in the first round, St. Louis in the second round, and an entirely depleted Edmonton team in the conference final. You know, that Edmonton team that I believe the leading minutes guy in that series for them was Tyson Barrie, how injured they were in on their back end. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to come back. We're going to tie a bow on those and rattle off our top 4s. So be sure to stick around. Thank you to everyone who's listening to Locked On NHL, and we need to use our time wisely, so here we go. Continuing along, just to tie a bow on that Avalanche point, that Avalanche team has got at least two future Hall of Famers in Makar and McKinnon, and Rantanen very well could get himself in there. But my differentiation point is basically at this point, it's the quality of the team. It's if you go player by player, you go band for band. Is the coach better than this coach? Are these players better than these players? Where do the accolades stack up? And it's just, I feel stronger about the teams I have ahead of Colorado. Not a knock on Colorado, but I feel that the Tampa Bay team, the first one, was better. You know, we're talking Kucherov, Hedman, Vasilevsky, Stamkos. Braden Point can play himself into that conversation depending on how the rest of his career goes. Ryan McDonough is going to be a fringe case who the American hockey people will bang the drum for. Just a little bit more talent than the Colorado teams, even if Colorado may be a little bit better results.
No, I hear you. I have that Colorado team number 4 on my list. I just felt like they were a little more dominant in their playoff run compared to that first Tampa Bay team.
Fair
That's
enough.
just how I look at it overall. I mean, 56-19-7 during the regular season, number 1 in the Central Division. And then, Nick, they just opened up a can of whoop-ass, excuse my language, in the playoffs. I mean, They sweep Nashville in the first round. They get past a Blues team, I feel like, fairly easily. They crush the Oilers. And then, I'm sorry, I know Tampa Bay got back to that final that year, but it felt like when you were watching that series, Tampa Bay was just gassed. It felt like Colorado and a lot of those games was skating circles around them. Just the process they had to get those results, how dominant they were overall in that run, has them a smidge above Tampa Bay, at least for me. Their high-end talent was incredible that run. Cale Makar, 29 points in 20 games. Ranson had 25 points. McKinnon was over a point per game. Same with Landeskog. Those 4 were tremendous throughout that one. Heck, Nichushkin was almost a point per game. Kadri had 15 points in 16 games. You know, Devon Taves was also great. You know, I know Tampa Bay also has quite a bit of elite talent. Colorado can stack up at least pretty well to Tampa Bay, I think, just when you look at that team overall. So I have that Colorado team number 4 on my list.
Number 4, I have the Florida team that won last month. I think this Florida team is going to age very nicely. Like, we're going to look back on that team a couple years from now, and the results are going to look a little more impressive. Their path, not terribly difficult. Their only real series, the only series where it genuinely felt like they were in danger of losing was the Cup final. You know, you think about that series against the Rangers. The Rangers did win 2 games, but overtimes were their only games they were able to win. They didn't really sweat against the Bruins, and they handled business very easily in the first round against Tampa Bay. So I think you can give them credit for the domination, especially in the early rounds. But when we get into the next handful of teams, we're going to talk about the team I have ranked first, who's got the best playoff 5-on-5 goal differential of the last 10 years. We're going to talk about the Tampa Bay team with multiple future Hall of Famers. And I think Florida's great. Don't get me wrong. But like you said, we're splitting hairs at this point.
Right. I have Florida number 3 on my list. They just reminded me so much of watching the 2016 Penguins throughout that run, with the way they were able to dominate possession, the way that they were also able to defend a lead in the third period. They didn't just sit back in those games. They took the attack to the other team, and they just really didn't allow anything in their own zone. They were so stingy defensively. They got contributions from everyone in their lineup. Sergei Bobrovsky was awesome. They were great in the first 3 rounds. It never felt like, even though they were down at times, Nick, to the Rangers, I feel like they were never truly in danger of losing that series, because I felt like the Panthers were the better team overall over the Rangers. And then their first 2 rounds, easily the better team. That Stanley Cup final, they were flat out dominant for the first half of that series before Edmonton came back with a purpose. And then Florida was just great in Game 7, obviously. But the 2 teams in front of them, I just think are, again, a smidge better. But that Florida team, one of the best of these last 10 years, one of the best teams, I would say, of the Cap era as well. That team was flat out dominant.
Agreed. Next up, number 3 on my list, I have, and I'm sorry, Hunter, I have the 2015-16 Penguins. The 2 teams I have ahead of them, I think Tampa Bay's roster is going to age in very well contemporaneously, that you're going to look back and say, how did the Lightning end up with 4 future Hall of Famers on that team? Gus Forsling was on that team. You're Blake Coleman and Yanni Gourde and Eric Chernak. And you're just going to look at that list down the road and be astounded. this is not a knock on the Pittsburgh team that was obviously very good. They absolutely obliterated the Rangers in the first round. Them in Washington, all-time great second-round series. That Tampa Bay team wasn't quite ready yet. They're coming off of the Cup final appearance where they had lost to Chicago, but very clearly we're still fine-tuning out the roster. And the one poor iteration of the Sharks that actually gets to the Stanley Cup final has to play a buzzsaw Penguins team. So I think the path is where I'm kind of dinging the Penguins, that it wasn't that difficult. But for the most part, like we've said more than once, we are talking about the smallest of margins for differentiation amongst these teams. That Penguins team, one of the deepest groups of the Stanley Cup, of the salary cap era, that's something that deserves a lot of credit for having a roster that well assembled with the limitations of what the salary cap was, 8 years ago. We're not talking about a whole lot of money. We're talking about $70-something million, I believe, was the salary cap 10 years ago. To assemble a roster that talented for that much money is so impressive.
Jim Rutherford did a great job. I'm going to save the Penguins for a little later. Yes, I'm pretty sure by process of elimination, everyone probably knows where I'm going to rank that 2016 Penguins team. Trust me, people, no, I'm not just being biased. I will give my objective reasons as to why I think that's the best Stanley Cup team of the last 10 years. Number 2, though, I do have the Vegas Golden Knights. I know you have them a little higher on yours. I think you probably have them, well, number 1, number 2 overall. So maybe it might be the same as mine, but that Vegas team, 51, 22, and 9 during the regular season. And the way they were just so dominant in their Stanley Cup run, Nick, they destroyed that Winnipeg team that caused Rick Bowness to really crush his team after that series. Yeah. People didn't give Vegas that much of a chance against Edmonton in round 2. I saw so many people picking the Oilers, McDavid and Draisaitl, they're going to feast in this series. And I was like, not so fast, especially with the way Vegas plays defensively. And you saw them really limit McDavid and Draisaitl and company in that series and just kind of frustrate them. That was a really great series win from the Knights. They then crushed the Stars in the conference final, and then they obliterate the Panthers, but also the Panthers were pretty banged up in that Stanley Cup final. I mean, Tkachuk was playing through, I believe it was a broken sternum, if I recall correctly, overall there. So they were just a really banged up team. But with how dominant Vegas was, I mean, Jack Eichel, well over a point per game. Jonathan Marchessault was incredible. Riley Smith had a couple of big goals for them. William Karlsson was awesome. The psychopath himself, Mark Stone, was a point per game player. The process led to all those results. They were very dominant. I have Vegas number 2 on my list.
I have the 1920 Lightning here at number 2. That Lightning team, it's remarkable. Obviously, salary cap shenanigans, so you can point that out where you want to. But the Cup final run, the circumstances, winning the Cup in the bubble, very, very unique and difficult environment. The real challenge for them in that Cup final run was the series against the Islanders. That Islanders team, you got to give Barry Trotz credit, reducing every game to a 2-1 or a 3-2 rock fight. It was effective. It really made Tampa Bay work. They handled business against Dallas, as you mentioned. That Columbus team, coming off of the year before where they had the best regular season ever, only to lose in the first round to the Blue Jackets in a sweep, to come back and respond the way they did the next year, to win the Cup in the circumstances in which they did in the bubble, it's truly remarkable. And part of why I rate them so highly is not only the talent, not only the path, not only the success along the path, but also the circumstances, the adversity. The season gets paused at the middle of March. They lay off till the 1st of August, and they come back and very clearly set themselves apart from everybody else within a week.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think all of that is very fair. I know I'm probably going to get some hate for ranking that Lightning team a little bit low. I just value a couple other things for the other teams just a little bit more. But trust me, I know how great that Lightning team was. They were also very dominant like some of those other teams. Number 1, Nick, you know where this is going. The 2015-16 Penguins I have as the top Stanley Cup winning team of the last 10 years. That Penguins team, they started out a bit slowly. Mike Sullivan takes over, and that team was a buzzsaw the rest of the way. I knew they had something special cooking. It was a little bit the end of March. They were playing the Capitals in Pittsburgh. The Capitals at that point, I felt like really had nothing to play for, but the Penguins, they took it to them that entire game. And I'm like, okay, it feels like they have something cooking here heading into the playoffs. They dismantled that Rangers team. Honestly, the Rangers are kind of lucky that they even won one game in that series with the way the Penguins are playing. Lundqvist did everything he could in that series, but that Penguins team just absolutely steamrolled them. That Capitals series was flat out awesome. The Penguins win that in 6 games. They then win a very close 7-game series against the Lightning. Though part of me kind of feels like the only reason why it went 7 was because Andrei Vasilevsky was so freaking good overall. Everyone quickly realized how good Vasilevsky was when he first came in. I mean, I remember I was only 18 at the time, but when Ben Bishop got hurt, I'm like, oh, I think the Lightning might be screwed here. I had no idea who Andrei Vasilevsky was. I quickly found out, considering how good he's been since then. That was his welcome to the NHL moment, and he stood on his head throughout that series, even though the Penguins were pushing play throughout. Yeah, the Lightning were able to match them at times. I feel like the Penguins made a blunder going back to Marc-Andre Fleury for a game, but they were able to go back to Murray, get those 2 wins in game 6 and 7, and then if it weren't for Martin Jones in the Stanley Cup final, Nick, I think the Penguins win that series probably in 5 games. But much like Florida, but to a little bit of a better extent, the way their high-end talent performed, the way they were so good defensively, Mike Sullivan's 1-2-2 neutral zone trap was fully on display throughout that Stanley Cup run. I think of these last 10 Stanley Cup champions, they're the best for me. Prime Crosby, Prime Malkin, Prime Letang. I mean, that was the best hockey I think I've ever seen Chris Letang play. He easily could have won the Conn Smythe that year, but I have that Penguins team number 1 overall.
I have Vegas number 1. I think the Vegas team, not as talented as that Penguins team. You know, we're talking Sid Malkin, 2 of the, 30 best players in the history of the sport, conservatively, in terms of Malkin. And the Vegas, Eichel probably eventually becomes a Hall of Famer. Pietrangelo will have a solid chance of becoming a Hall of Famer. But the thing that separates Vegas apart for me is they were just a machine at 5-on-5. You outscore opponents 66-33 at 5-on-5. Utter domination. Just an absolute buzzsaw. And it doesn't matter that they had Aiden Hill in net. That's how good they were up front at 5-on-5, that they were able to dominate in that way. And the path was really difficult to go through Edmonton, Dallas, and Florida. Contemporaneously, that Oilers team, slight tweaks, got to the Cup final the next year. Florida won the Stanley Cup the next season. And you put that combination of the path, the dominance at 5-on-5, and the way in which they were able to smoke that Florida team. Of course, the Florida team was very injured and kind of cooling off of its heater and had an improbable path to get there. But you look at it contemporaneously in comparison, where the Oilers were the following year, where Florida was the following year, and the domination. You talk about Marchessault, you talk about Eichel, Stone putting together a largely healthy playoff run. Stone, somebody who, if his body doesn't fail him, I think is on roller skates to the Hall of Fame, and instead is going to be he's going to be a borderline case where if there's a down year, he could probably get in. But it is really crazy when you think about how much talent there is in the league now, that when you compare and look at some of these teams from the past 10 years, we're talking about teams with 3, 4 5 great players. And then you look at the teams this year that were in the Cup final, and really quickly you start to realize just how fortunate it is that all of this is happening at once, that all of these great players are in the league at once.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And just with that Vegas team, it just felt inevitable that they were going to win that year, especially after that first round series win. I know they had that very tough series against the Oilers in round 2, and I know a lot of people picked against them, but I still was very confident that they were going to shut them down, just because I know how good of a coach Bruce Cassidy is, and he still is, by the way. And the way that he was able to come up with a game plan to shut down Edmonton's top players, the way they were able to just buzzsaw their way throughout that Stanley Cup run, it was a sight to behold. Again, slimmest of margins for those 2 teams. And man, overall, this was a lot of fun to rank these teams. I know I'm probably going to get a lot of crap for ranking the Lightning at number 5, but hey, that's just how I see it overall.
That's what makes this type of stuff fun. It's a lighthearted conversation. You get to reminisce on past fun and put things in context. So that'll do it for this week's edition of Locked On NHL. So if you could be so kind, make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please throw the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Rank your top 10, rank the last 10 Cup winners in the comments. And before we get out of here, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now is also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day. The local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available free in the Fire TV channels app. Hunter and I will see you guys next week.